Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous pleasure to me to be back in Jerusalem. This is my first speech in this region since my last speech in Doha, and I'm hoping for a warmer reception today than I had then, but we'll see. That wasn't a cue. No, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to Tikva in particular for arranging this extraordinary event. It's a great pleasure and an honor also to be following Yoram Hatzoni, whose work I've followed very closely and often cited, most recently I think in Berlin last month when I was in a debate about nationalism with the former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, and decided to go straight for the jugular of my audience in that discussion by citing Hatzoni's work and saying, of course, the problem is not that nationalism is a problem everywhere. It's not a problem in Africa, Middle East, and all sorts of other places. It's a problem in Europe. And as I said to my German audience, it's particularly a problem in Germany, and that's what we're really worried about, isn't it? We're worried that Germans can't cope with nationalism. A point that went down quite well. In any case, I also would like to say how much I agree with his comment there about the form of indoctrination, to put it no stronger, that occurs in universities and elsewhere in much of the West, not everywhere, but a significant portion of the West. This is the arrangement by which American families, for instance, remortgage their houses to send their children away to university to become stupider. But also this curious situation that we've got to where intelligent people find it incredibly easy to maintain the most delusional abstract ideas in public, but cannot defend concrete ideas in public. And this is a massive issue of our time. Now, there is, and I should say this at the outset, there is an enormous advantage that leftists always have over conservatives. Everywhere you go in the world, wherever you go, the left always want exactly the same things in pretty much exactly the same order. This is in many ways boring, predictable, very well organized, and a great advantage. Whereas conservatives do have one particular inbuilt disadvantage, which is that everyone in each different country is always conserving something slightly different. I'm in a different country most weeks, and I find this even in countries you'd have thought of as being very similar. In Denmark, they are conserving something different from what people are conserving in Sweden or Norway. To an outsider, that seems crazy. But each of these places, small as they are conserving different traditions. There are different things that they're proud of, different aspects of their culture that they particularly want to hold on to, that an outsider might not understand. And this is simultaneously an enormous disadvantage for conservatives globally. But of course, that innate understanding is one of the great advantages locally. Now, Israel is different from most of the countries I speak about in my last book, The Strange Death of Europe, in. And I'll give you 3 reasons why. When I speak about this book in Europe, it's definitely not the case that nationalism or even patriotism is something you can talk about as a force primarily of good. That is a very distinct difference from Israel. Of course, not everybody in this country has exactly the same views on this. I've noticed in the times I've visited Israel that homogeneity of views is not necessarily an Israeli virtue. But broadly speaking, the mainstream of Israeli society recognizes that nationalism is a force of good and for Israel. That is not the case in Europe. It's not even, I would suggest, the case in countries like my own, albeit there's a strong patriotic strand still that it has attempted to make itself heard in recent years in particular. But nationalism is viewed in a very different light in Europe, for reasons I don't need to elaborate, to the way in which it's viewed here. A second example of a hearing difference, borders. Here in Israel, broadly speaking, the Israeli public recognize that strong borders, holding on to that concrete idea of borders, is a prerequisite for peace. Not so in Europe, where borders are believed to be, erroneously I think, the cause of war. Not completely erroneously. Before 1939-45, Europe did indeed go to war again over borders in 1914-18, a catastrophe also we haven't entirely got over. But that means that borders, the idea that if you hold on to hard borders, you're likely to have peace, is an idea which has suffered, at the very least, in recent decades. And a third example of something which is a hearing difference between Europe and Israel, and that is religion. Again, it's not as if there is a homogeneous view about religion in this country. But to a considerable extent, in my observation, even the most secular Israelis recognize that they are in some way in dialogue with the religion which has given birth to this country, the ideals of Zionism, and much more. That people at least have to be in communion with the religion of their forebears. They have to contend with it. Again, not so in Europe, where religion is one of the things, along with, I would suggest, philosophy, almost all culture, and much more, which is, as I described in my book, all of these things are as if they are behind crime scene tape still. There is still police tape around all of these things. And not for bad reasons either. You know, this is, I always say, the worst type of criticism is criticism that has a point. And all of this has a point. It's not as if our fear about borders is completely insane. It's not as if our fear about philosophy is completely insane. But still, we're trying to work out what happened in our 20th century. And all of these things still spell danger. It's why ideas have been reduced in Europe to a sort of form of hermeneutical wordplay. The best you can hope from philosophy is the philosophy of language, for instance. Why? Because people are terrified of the bigger questions. Because they think if we go back to bigger, deeper questions, we'll do the 20th century all over again. We can't trust ourselves with ideas any more than we can trust ourselves with nationalism. Now, the two aspects of the book, The Strange Death of Europe, that I particularly focused on are, and this is very reductive, but you'll appreciate in the short space of time I have, one has to be reductive. I might boil it down to a them question and an us question. The them question being the migration question, the us question being obviously about Europeans. In the 2 years since this book came out in English, I've noticed, and I think in 30-odd languages, including Arabic next, which should be interesting. I've noticed that everywhere there is a great interest in the them component, the migration component. And let me, for that reason, dwell on this for a moment. The facts in Europe are extraordinary. I've noticed them all my adult life. I've been fascinated by them all my adult life, and I've also been fascinated by the difficulty we still have in talking about this. All my life, immigration has been the single issue most able to detonate and destroy a person's career. It's the most dangerous component. And So to a great extent, the facts have been able to happen not unchallenged, but with very significant lack of challenge. In the 2011 census in my own country in Great Britain, every religion saw a significant fall-off, most obviously Christianity, a massive decline in affiliation with the Christian churches, whereas people who identified as Muslim had doubled in the UK in that decade and were predicted to double in the decade we're currently in. One of the other findings of that census, this is the UK's official census, was that people who identified as white British, that's the definition used by the census, not myself, people who identified as white British were a minority in London. They were a minority in 23 out of the 33 London boroughs. So this is a very, very significant demographic shift. And although many people would like it to go on unremarked upon, certainly many people in the media and politics and more would like it to go unremarked upon, the general public can, of course, see these things and is developing concern about them. I focus in the book on the crisis of 2015, and I just for a moment give you some of the figures on that. In 2015, when the movement first of Syrians, but then of people from a veritable United Nations, and I saw this all firsthand in the ports of Greece and Italy, when millions of people started to head towards Europe, Germany took in, by the domestic intelligence agencies' estimate, up to 1.5 million people in 1 year. That's 2 to 3% added to the German population in 12 months, and Sweden was the only other country to have a comparable intake, but that was also around 2 to 3% added to the population. Now, these are very significant shifts of people, and as I show in the book, there are a whole set of questions that we failed to ask during this process, the most basic of which is the one I sum up as the question we should have asked ourselves, which is, can Europe be the home for everyone in the world who wants to move in and call it home? The obvious answer to that is no, it can't. But this is one of the concrete ideas you have to find a way to hold on to in public. Fine, then who can't it be? Very difficult question, but one I suggest we should have been thinking about for some time. I relate in the book a conversation between your Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Chancellor Merkel at the height of the migration crisis in October 2015, when Chancellor Merkel called Prime Minister Netanyahu and asked for some advice and help, specifically because she said that Israel was the only country in the modern era to have had to absorb a similar percentage of people in a short space of time. And she was thinking here presumably of Russian Jews coming to this country, and what lessons were there that Israel could give to Germany. I mention in an editorial aside in my book that Prime Minister Netanyahu was almost certainly too diplomatic to mention that Israel had an advantage over Germany in this regard, and that in the months and years ahead, Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues would discover that most of the arrivals into Germany in 2015 were not German Lutherans. But these are massive shifts of populations, which I think, as I say, cannot go unremarked upon. But the us bit is even more interesting to me. And I've noticed since my book came out that it's the bit that almost nobody wants to challenge me on, which worries me because it means I might be right. But I mean this seriously because what I diagnose as the condition of modern European mankind is a very bleak prognosis. And I was deeply hoping that people were going to not just contend with this, but to challenge it. And I've found to date nobody doing so. The diagnosis I have begins with the question, not what is happening to us, but why would any society do this to itself? Which is in some ways, as I say, a much more interesting as well as deeper question. Now, I suggest that there are a whole set of reasons, the first of which remains the single biggest question, the philosophical question to contend with in modern Europe, which is the question of guilt. There's been in recent decades what I say is a spreading around of German post-war guilt, so that even in a country like my own, there is the suggestion that we also have a responsibility for the crimes of Germany in the 20th century. And that whereas the West can be judged and Europe can be judged always and everywhere by its worst points, everybody else in the world will be judged only at their best. And this leaves us, among other things, all coping with this question of guilt, which has now spread also to the post-colonial guilt. And again, it's not as if these questions are questions without any foundation or basis. What I'm surprised at is that the question, for instance, of post-colonial guilt, like Second World War guilt, is absolutely everywhere. It is felt by people in Britain, and we ran famously quite a lot of the globe, and it's also felt in Sweden, which ran none of the globe. So this is interesting to me. Why do countries have the same amount of historical burden, irrespective of how they acted in history? But there's a set of other things I'll come on to quickly. And one of them is the thing I describe in the book as the sense of the story having run out. And this has something to do with the crime scene tape. This is the idea that we basically don't dare to go back to any of the things that matter because we can't trust ourselves with them and we can't surpass them. And so we've ended up in this situation that the English philosopher Sir Roger Scruton describes as the culture of self-abnegation, the culture of warring on everything you have, of wanting to deny everything you have. It was beautifully summed up to me the other night in Berlin by a young German female student who said to me, "Why is it that my generation travel halfway around the world to visit the temples of Asia, but you never see them in the cathedrals of Europe?" And this is a very important and deep point. It's not as if it's an either-or, but it's very odd to go to Siem Reap if you've never been to Chartres on your doorstep. So why is this? Why do we have this desire to get away from Europe? Well, as I say, it's for a lot of reasons, deep reasons, but ones that really need to be thought about and contended with and got through, if not over. Let me just finish by saying a couple of things about that. To my own mind, conservatism is about one thing in particular. It's about conserving the things you love and that have worked well for you. Very often the left and the far left have an advantage over conservatives. They have a lot of theorists they can cite. And yet that thing at the heart of the general publics, I think, in many, if not most countries, recognizes that what has worked for their forebears may well work for them as well. And that's not such a stupid idea, much as conservatives are derided as stupid by many people. But this attitude of love for the things that have made you is a very hard thing to communicate for many people, because love is a more embarrassing thing to talk about than hate. And so I suggest, and I will perhaps finish on this, I suggest that when I speak with those who disagree with me, and there are some, I say, why not approach it in a different way, which is, you don't have to be a nationalist, you don't have to be wildly patriotic, you don't have to fly flags or any of that. But let's say that your attitude should be one of gratitude. Gratitude and the recognition that what else is, of what the other things are that you could have been born into, and therefore how lucky you are. And that seems to me, at any rate, a much healthier place to educate the young and to begin our own thinking from than that culture of self-hate and self-abnegation. So with that, I hand over to my colleague who's going to come up and quiz me and expose my failings. Thank you.
I'm afraid it's not the task I was given, to quiz you and challenge you, but I'll try my best. First of all, I would like to thank you for a fascinating lecture, and more than that, for a fascinating book. which is very well recommended. And I would like to ask, first and foremost, about the name of the book, The Strange Death of Europe. So to put it bluntly, is it terminal, doctor?
Well, I told my publishers when it came out in English that I wanted to give a diagnosis that was as accurate as I could. And my publisher said, well, you must give people some hope. So I wrote a chapter saying what could be done, followed by a chapter saying what I think we will do. Nothing is written. If we had political and other leaders willing to get us out of some of these scrapes, if we simply had political leaders willing to sustain some concrete ideas in public, we could get out of them. But I don't see it at the moment, or at least I don't see a way through that's respectful, because we don't have the political leaders willing to do some of these things, and some of the people who do want to do it are not decent people.
So we'll get to the leaders which you criticize all over the book, but this is not only a story about Europe, immigration, liberalism versus conservatives, but first and foremost, in my opinion, it's a story about how the liberal media and the elites actually set the borders of the public discourse, thus making it illegitimate to have other positions towards immigration.
Yes.
Do you think the social media era can change it? Or to put it in different ways, is Mark Zuckerberg a friend or foe?
Well, of course, this will be a totally alien concept to an Israeli audience, but the media does have a slant. I knew it wouldn't work.
Know nothing about it.
Let me give an example of what I think is going on at the moment. We're in a period of great confusion about information, as we all know, and many people have written about. We used to know the direction, the way in which we would read news. So, for instance, if I read The Economist, it would land on my doorstep. I would think, oh, my homework, and I would read a bit of it. But I knew where it was coming from. I know where it's coming from. And I know how to read it in order to filter out what's useful to me, and the editorializing from a specific direction, okay, but that's The Economist. The problem we're all going through at the moment is how to have the number of filters we need for the number of outlets that we're having to absorb. And we don't know what our attitude is towards a whole set of publications and sites and so on. So we're finding it difficult to trust information. But in Europe, this has a much worse thing added to it. And this is different in different countries, but the worst country for this is Germany. In the German media, almost every day, there are stories which the German public have to work out for themselves. And it goes something like this. Last night, a thing happened to a person in a place. You don't know the identity of the person who did the thing. You're given as little information as possible about the place and what happened. And so the Germans go, a migrant did something.
We have the same case here, that rockets are being fired towards the road. No one actually fires the rockets.
Right, they are autonomous.
Yes. Exactly.
This is a very common pathology, by the way. A friend of mine in Britain, who's a former prison doctor, Theodore Dalrymple, he writes as the name under which he writes, says this is something he noticed in a lot of criminals he worked with in prison, that they always said things like, you know, somebody who stabbed somebody to death, for instance, would say, and I just saw red, I was in a rage, and the knife just went in. As if the knife had its own propulsion, and that you as an individual had no responsibility. This is a very common thread. Yeah. But as I say, it worries me that across Europe things happen and people are having to work it out for themselves, because the job of the media in Europe has largely imagined itself to have is to stand equidistant between the facts and the public. So the public can't deal with the facts. They might do terrible things if they have the facts. And maybe there's something in that in some places.
Is it done deliberately?
Oh, yeah. And it is. We can't trust the public with this because we don't know what they do. Okay. Now, the great thing about this, as you allude to, is that the era of social media has both deranged us and also given us a possible answer. So Mark Zuckerberg is a friend some days and a massive foe on others.
Yes, because he wants to act as an editor-in-chief.
But it's so beautiful seeing it backfire, isn't it? I mean, that people were meant to absorb only one type of news, and then they absorb the wrong news, and they go to the wrong people, and then the public have the wrong opinions, and they vote for the wrong people. Yeah. And then the politicians just have to forgive the public.
But this is the case when it comes to Germany. It seems you don't, I mean, I have the vague impression that you don't like Angela Merkel.
We don't send each other Christmas cards.
Exactly. So how come she has been elected over and over again by a very conservative political base, if she acts against the very fundamental ideas of the very certain base?
Well, the trick on the immigration question for a long time in center-right politics in Europe has been you do basically the same things as the center-left, but you occasionally say something tough. So Angela Merkel gave a famous speech in 2010 where she said that multiculturalism had failed. And people thought, finally a politician has said the truth. By the way, she was aided by the fact that this word multiculturalism is very, very vague. Some people hear it as multiracialism. Actually, for most people in power, it's recognized to be a specific political idea that you allow people to live their own lives in the country that they're in. The country is a sort of cohering body. But when she says this, a lot of the German public think, finally, a politician who's telling the truth. And actually, they don't do anything. In fact, of course, 5 years after she said multiculturalism had failed in Germany, she then...
Multiculti.
She then massively exacerbated by having the single largest inflow of people in post-war history. And so what was it that you'd done in the 5 years between saying that speech in Potsdam and then opening the borders of Germany? What had you done to make sure it was going to work? The answer is nothing.
But do you think Angela Merkel really wants Germany to be filled with hostile immigrants from Muslim countries? Or she just doesn't have the courage to fix the situation?
Well, again, this is one of these problems that isn't based in nothing. So we now know from two people who were close to her on the last day of August 2015 when she said unilaterally that the borders of Germany would no longer be, the normal border procedures would no longer be applied in Germany, thus massively increasing the flow of people coming into Europe. Two people close to her said that what happened was that she said, among other things, that photographs could not go round the world of German border guards repelling migrants. She just wouldn't have it. And again, it's not as if that isn't understandable. She was deeply fearful of this, and you could see the German public. At Munich train station, where 10,000 people were arriving every 48 hours, people in the German public were high-fiving the arrivals, giving them balloons. This was not something for a philosopher or political analyst. This was something for a psychiatrist. This was people so happy that people were breaking into their country rather than trying to break out.
It's still better than the Israeli case in which we hugged a serial terrorist who killed hundreds of Israelis, giving him the Nobel Peace Prize. So you still have way to go. So as for Angela Merkel.
The one other thing, of course, she is aided by is the fact that you can point to potential opposition elements in Germany and say, watch out, watch out. That, by the way, that cordon sanitaire is breaking everywhere in Europe, which is a subject of deep concern and should be something which people look at with great care, but they don't. But so long as it's possible to say it's either me or the Nazis, you're in a good position, aren't you?
Exactly.
It's too easy. But
So maybe this is the explanation for the difference between Europe and the rest of the world. Maybe they are post-traumatic. So I'll put it differently. Where do you draw the line between good nationalism and opposing immigration and bad nationalism and racism?
Well, this is one of those things that you know it when you see it.
And don't you see it?
Yes. And country to country, it's very different.
No, I mean racist sentiments.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's all sorts of ways to draw that line. In my own country, for instance, in Britain, there's almost no racism in public life of any meaningful kind. It's the single fastest and best way for somebody to lose any position they would have in public life. There is no tolerance of racism, and all of the social attitude surveys show in Britain a great tolerance, an overwhelming tolerance for instance, intermarriage, being friends with people of different races and backgrounds. So this is one of the aspects of the game that's being played on the public that is so disturbing, which is the most tolerant people keep being presented as if they're the world's biggest bigots. And this goes country to country, where opinion polls, now, again, the opinion polls show some very specific concerns in Europe. For instance, even before the attacks of 2015, 70% of the French public said that Islam as a religion was incompatible with the French state because of its attitudes towards women. Now, that's a very specific concern. But the response of the elites in politics has been to say the public are bigots, rather than what is it that the public are worried about, and what in it is legitimate, and what in it is something we will have to argue about. Mm-hmm. Because yes, there are people, France is a good example of it, there are people waiting in the wings who you would not wish to be waiting in the wings. But instead of saying that the answer to that is to dismiss majority public opinion, the answer to that surely would be to take in the bit that is legitimate as a grievance and address that and keep out the bit that is worst. And yet, as I say, the cordon has been drawn in such a way that it effectively keeps out majority public opinion.
But you live in a world in which Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, in which Benjamin Netanyahu has just won the 12th time in a row, in my opinion. Although, I mean, in spite of all those sentiments fostered by the liberal media. So maybe it's not the excuse. How come Germany or the UK do not have leadership from the type you think is needed for Europe?
Well, this country perhaps accepted, and America perhaps accepted. There is a problem in all the democracies at the moment. I was in Australia last summer, and I'd arranged to see the Prime Minister and had to postpone by a week, and a week later he wasn't Prime Minister, so I postponed again. But there is a common fragility everywhere, and I think it's necessary. The precondition is it's necessary to walk through almost all received wisdom in order to get to the place you need to get, and you have to be in a very strong position individually as well as politically to do that. I think there's an enormous, I mean, one of the things, if I may say so, from outside of Britain I'm often struck by is how many people internationally wonder why Britain in particular would be stuck in such a weak position. People expect that Britain would be the country of any country in Europe that would have strong and reasonable leadership. Well, not yet, we don't. But what is really needed is you need to, or at least people who are not politicians need to assist politicians to develop the lexicon in which to talk about very difficult questions. Yep. And that's the same on every single hot-button issue. I mean, as I say, I tried to do it with the immigration question. If somebody says, why can this person not come? A politician should say, fine, who in the world can't come? And they don't do that. They don't play that game back. I did it recently to a Labour politician. I said to her, who can't come to Britain? Who don't we want more of? And I can see her eyes right there. Oh, no, my entire career is on the line. So I said, who don't we want more of? And she said, we don't want any more criminals. Okay. And I said, well, okay, fine. Let's say a boy who was 14 in Tunisia stole a loaf of bread, and now he's 18 and he'd like to come to Europe. Why are you saying he's got to be kept out? Why him? Okay, war criminals shouldn't come. I said, that's about 6 people in The Hague, and none of them are applying to come to the UK. But you see my point. You have to force them to the difficult argument because they've been getting away with blandishments for decades.
And when you articulate those arguments, do you feel personally that your position as a journalist is at stake? Not today, because you're very popular today, but 7 years ago.
Well, I don't care. I think that if you're interested, I think the only point of writing is to pursue truth. And if you don't want to pursue truth, I mean, there are plenty of other jobs to do in the world. And if you don't want to pursue truth, you shouldn't be a writer.
But
and you have to follow it wherever it goes.
Were you never afraid?
Well, I've trodden a precarious path in my life. And not everything I say goes down very well with everybody. Mm-hmm. I don't mind about any unpopularity. Again, that shouldn't bother anyone interested in truth. The truth is very often deeply unpopular, but there it is. Yeah. I do mind the fact that in the continent I'm from, criticisms of certain religions do bring personal problems, and I've had rather too many friends shot in the same profession across Europe to feel totally comfortable about that. But again, what are you going to do? Lie? Shut up?
So let's speak about Christianity. You do not claim it explicitly in your book, but it seems you think that the remedy against the European surrender to hostile immigration is Christianity. Yet the values you stand for would not be accepted by the Christian establishment. So can you have the cake and eat it too? Can you save the values you believe in without being religious?
As a non-believer myself, I say that it's a necessity to engage with your religious heritage, to be in communion and dialogue with it, at least. That's why I follow the advice that Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope, said. He said, I try to live as though God existed, which was the advice he gave to Oriana Fallaci. And I think that you have to remain... I can see no way through for Europe that consists of jettisoning its religious heritage, and I don't want to jettison it.
But how far would it go without belief?
Well,
I mean, can you have hundreds of millions of scholar agnostics? It won't work.
Well, my suggestion is, for those who can't believe, you can't force them. So you have to find an attitude towards them that isn't just believe or go away. And I describe in the book why we in Europe in particular have got to the situation we have in regards to belief. But my own view is that the role of the churches ought to be on an issue like migration, that the state has very clear boundaries, it holds very strong border policies, and the role of the churches is effectively to inject into that dialectic the care and the love and all of these things that are part of the Christian teachings about our attitudes towards others. Now, the problem is that if the states are very weak on this and the churches preach only what Pope Francis, for instance, teaches, or what the Scandinavian churches teach. The Scandinavian churches have basically become Greenpeace at prayer, and they, the heads of the churches, do this stuff of Jesus was a migrant, for instance. Jesus was a Palestinian, of course, in their teaching as well. But
of course,
but Jesus was a migrant, and by the way, I've been so polite today, but let me just not be for a moment. My most politically incorrect thing I ever say, and maybe I can get away with it, but we'll see. My most politically incorrect thing I ever say is, when the churches say Jesus was a migrant, I always say, you ought to watch out for that, because he also went back to where he came from. So careful.
Okay. One last question before you get tougher questions from the audience, from Tikva students. There are two perceptions in Israel for how to deal with the far right, what the media calls far right European parties. One is that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And the other option, for instance, a position articulated by our president, is that Israel should not cooperate with racists. What would you do if you were Israeli?
I'd want your president to be specific about who he was talking about.
For instance, Viktor Orban.
Is not a racist. Is not a racist. Nor, and this is very important, nor is he an anti-Semite.
Strache's party in Austria.
A trickier question.
Okay.
This requires unbelievably fine surgical analysis, if I may say so. And this surgery is currently being carried out by the media, in the media, by chimpanzees. You cannot just pretend that everybody in Europe who is of the right is a Nazi. It's not going to work. We're going to lose all of our terminology, as well as the whole fight, to actually keep actual bigots and racists away. And this is why I say, in each of these cases, in each country, look, it's different even within some parties. Yep. Take the AfD in Germany. Are they all Nazis? No.
Or the Swedish
Democrats. The Swedish Democrats came from a position in the 1990s where they were a racist party. Are they today? No. But do they have some people in it?
No, but they want to ban, for instance, Brit. They want to circumcision. They want to ban importing, slaughtering kosher meat, for instance. Sure. Isn't it anti-Semitic sentiment?
Let's get on to that as well then. Again, this is unbelievably fine analysis is required on this. I am very suspicious and disdainful of parties that go, for instance, against Shechita slaughter or circumcision. I think it's a crazy priority to make. But look, again, country to country and party to party, you've got to be very careful before wielding the anti-Semitism accusation. And it's been fired off like a machine gun across Europe. And this is unwise, because are there anti-Semites? Yes. Our Labour Party in Britain is run by one. Okay? Her Majesty's opposition is led by a man who, at the very least, has spent his entire life totally comfortable with every variety of anti-Semite. And that's the party of the left. It's disgracing the Labour tradition in the UK. But I want us to make sure we can make those diagnoses. And if everybody you don't like for short-term political gain is an anti-Semite, it's not going to work. So, as I say, a realistic and informed diagnosis is what's needed.
Questions from the audience? Yes, please.
First, thank you very much for the very fascinating discussion. My name is Tom. I am a PhD student of international relations from the Hebrew University, and my research focuses on Europe, integration, immigration, etc. We can see all over the continent that Eurosceptic parties are gaining more and more power, and they all mainly raise the same issue of immigration. We see it in Italy, in France, in Hungary, Poland, now even in Spain, practically everywhere. So do you think that the coming elections for the European Parliament may lead to a drastic change in European politics, and especially on immigration policies? And if not, do you see any scenario in which the current situation will lead to some sort of a civil war in Europe?
The European elections are next week. We're voting for them in Britain. It hasn't gone unnoticed by the British public that 3 years ago we voted to leave the European Union, and next week we're being invited to vote again in European Parliament elections. It's what do they call it? The California Hotel or whatever. You know, you can check out, but you can't leave. I expect that parties who are now called populist, that's a new way to dismiss the public. This wretched public, they keep voting for populists. It may just be popular. But these parties will do much better than they have before. I think, yes, I think the League in Italy has already since last March massively surged in the polls domestically in Italy. I think these parties will benefit, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate it. There's a tactic I've noticed now of the left in Europe to exaggerate the potential electoral gains of their enemies, so that when they do very well but less well than expected, they say, the populist bubble has burst. So I wouldn't expect a massive change. And by the way, the European Parliament is very resistant to any change anyway. It's what happens at the Commission that's going to matter much more. And we in Britain, by the way, there's this thing you hear that we're going to really send a message to Brussels by sending a bunch of real nutters there next week. And as I've said before, it's not clear how that, from the European point of view, how that differs from the British policy in regards to the European Union of recent decades. They think that we've been sending them our worst for a long time. But no, I mean, I think that we are trying to send a message again. But the message, I say very quickly, the message is very interesting. We in Britain saw that the massive issue was sovereignty. We no longer were sure about how we were governed, how we voted people into power, and how we voted them out. And in the 3 years since the second largest contributor to the EU budget voted by a majority to leave the EU, we have flayed our political class in Britain, flayed them, and Jean-Claude Juncker is still there. So whenever I feel bad about Brexit or feel any moroseness about the fact that it's been going so badly, I look at the European Commission and its inability to adapt, and I think, no, we were right.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your arrival and for your wonderful book. My name is Dara Schleifer. I work with Tikva Fund in the Exodus program that promotes conservative ideas, and I'm a political science student in Tel Aviv University. And my question is, in case that the leaders of Europe decide to close the borders, as you suggest, and prohibit or almost prohibit immigration, still a huge part of the public may think that something must be done about the horrible things that indeed happen in the world. So, do you think that Europe and the West should do something that is not immigration, about the terrible wars and regimes that indeed are happening in the Middle East and Africa? Do you think that there is some solution or some help that we can offer and maybe stop feeling so guilty?
That's a very good question and a very tricky one to answer, but let me give it a go. It's my view that in the liberal West, one of our deepest worries is how to cope with our luck. Okay, and this isn't as if this comes from nowhere. We look at the rest of the world and we think, wow, what an accident of birth. I could have been born in Eritrea, where life is just miserable, and conscription of early teens and no way out, a prison-like society. So we look at these places and we think, we don't think it enough, but we think, wow, I'm lucky. And then how to contend with that luck? Our current answer is share our luck with the rest of the world if it makes it here. And I think this is an understandable response and a suicidal response. By the way, it's interesting, I made this remark recently to a Norwegian politician who said, no, you shouldn't talk about it in these terms. It's not just luck. Norway, there's a reason why Norway isn't Venezuela. We had similar energy reserves, but we did better and we made wiser decisions for a generation. And this itself is a very important point to make. It's not just luck. It's individual people making rational and sensible decisions for the long term, however uncomfortable it might be in the short term. And again, one other point on this. It is so much harder than anyone is willing to admit. In the refugee camps of Southern Europe, I spoke to an Afghan family, for instance, who said, why should Germany be giving priority to Syrian migrants? They said, they've only been at war for 5 years. Our country's been at war for 15 years. Very good point. Okay, so let's say every country that's had a war, its citizens have the right to come to Europe. Then what about people who are fleeing economic deprivation? Last year, a poll in sub-Saharan Africa said 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africa wants to move. Okay, what are you going to do about that? And one other, before we go to the last question, one other. This is the hardest. I often think it's worth finding the hardest bit of the problem, identifying it and see what you can do. Here's the hardest bit. At the height of the migration crisis, Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, said, "This is why we need to improve living standards in the countries these people come from." Here's the hardest one. If you improve living standards in sub-Saharan Africa, more people will move. Now this, I stress, is not a reason not to improve living standards in poor countries, but it's a heck of a challenge. Why will they move? Because they'll have more money to pay for the smuggling networks, which is the fast way out. Okay, that's the sort of discussion I'd like to see at a major political level. That's the sort of discussion I'd like to see. How can we help the poor and dispossessed of the world and not encourage them all to move to London? But we don't have that discussion.
Thank you very much, Douglas Murray. It was a pleasure.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.